When Karen decided my fence was blocking her $1 million view, she didn't she didn't hire a lawyer. She brought in a bulldozer. What happened next turned our quiet neighborhood into a full-blown courtroom drama in almost every neighborhood with a homeowners association. Hoa, there's always at least one person who thinks the rules exist for everyone else but them. In this story, that person was Karen. From the moment she moved into the neighborhood, she seemed determined to assert control over everything, from how high people's grass could grow to what color flowers were aesthetic enough for the community guidelines. When it came to the fence, things escalated quickly. Karen's property sat on a slightly elevated hill, giving her a nice backyard view. But her neighbor's wooden privacy fence, standing tall and sturdy for years, blocked part of her sightline toward the open field behind the houses. For most people, a fence is just a fence, practical, necessary, and within property lines. But for Karen, it was a personal offense. At the last HOA meeting, she stood up dramatically and declared, "That fence ruins the view for everyone on this block. It needs to come down." The room fell silent, partly because the request was outrageous, and partly because Karen delivered it with the kind of theatrical rage usually reserved for courtroom dramas. She insisted that the fence violated some obscure community visibility clause, though no one could find the exact wording she was quoting. Her neighbor calmly reminded her that the fence had been approved years ago, inspected, and even grandfathered in under the HOA earlier guidelines. Still, Karen wouldn't budge. She shouted about how her property value was being destroyed, how the neighborhood would never attract buyers with ugly wooden walls dividing every yard, and how she personally deserved better because she paid the highest HOA fees on the block. The HOA board tried to mediate, suggesting compromise, maybe trimming the fence, planting shrubs, or even building a shared lattice design. But Karen refused every option. She pointed her finger at her neighbor and yelled, "You're selfish! You care more about your little fence than about this community." Her outbursts weren't just confined to meetings. Neighbors reported hearing her shouting in her yard, waving her arms, pointing toward the fence as if it were a criminal intruder. One evening, she even called the HOA president at 10 p.m. to complain that the fence was ruining her sunset. The exaggeration was almost laughable, but to those who lived nearby, it was exhausting. The shouting fit a pattern. Whenever Karen didn't get her way, she escalated into a loud public scene. It wasn't about the fence anymore. It was about dominance, about bending the HOA rules to her will. Her neighbors began documenting her behavior, anticipating that sooner or later, Karen would take matters into her own hands. And, as the title of the story suggests, that's exactly what she did when she brought in heavy equipment to bulldoze the fence. But before that shocking act, the image that stuck in everyone's mind was Karen, arms flailing, voice echoing across the street, shouting as if a wooden fence were her mortal enemy. For her, the battle lines weren't just painted on the property survey, they were shouted into existence for the whole HOA to hear. In most HOA disputes, the battles are fought with paperwork, angry emails, and tense board meetings. Rarely do they involve heavy machinery. But when Karen decided that her neighbor's fence was an eyesore that violated her view rights, she escalated the situation in the most outrageous way imaginable. She brought in a bulldozer. It began one Saturday morning. The neighborhood was quiet, families sipping coffee on their porches, children riding bikes along the cul-de-sac. Then the rumble started. At first, people assumed it was construction down the road. But as the sound grew louder, neighbors peeked out of their windows to see a flatbed truck backing into Karen's driveway. On it sat a bright yellow bulldozer, glaring in the sun like some kind of war machine. Word spread fast. "The Karen's got a bulldozer," one neighbor texted in disbelief. Another snapped photos, sending them straight to the HOA group chat. By the time Karen marched outside in her oversized sunglasses and sun hat, half the block was watching from their yards. Karen announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "The HOA has ignored my complaints for too long. If no one else will take down this illegal fence, I'll do it myself." Her voice carried across the cul-de-sac, followed by the unmistakable roar of the bulldozer's engine starting. Her neighbor, the fence's rightful owner, rushed outside in shock. He shouted, "You can't do this. That fence is on my property line." But Karen waved him off like he was an annoying mosquito. "I'm doing this for the good of the community. Everyone deserves a view." The Hawaii president, notified by panicked phone calls, tried to intervene, but by the time he arrived, Karen had already convinced the operator, rumored to be a cousin of hers, to lower the bulldozer's blade. The sound of splintering wood echoed down the street as the machine pushed against the sturdy fence, sending boards flying like matchsticks. Neighbors gasped. Some filmed the spectacle on their phones, certain this would go viral. Others whispered about lawsuits, property damage, and Hawaii bylaws. After all, this wasn't just a neighborly spat anymore. It was destruction of private property carried out in broad daylight. The HOA handbook, ironically, was very clear about fence regulations. It specified maximum heights, approved materials, even stain colors. But nowhere in its 50-odd pages did it give permission for one homeowner to demolish another's fence with heavy machinery. Karen, of course, didn't care. She claimed she was restoring community aesthetics, twisting the language of the HOA guidelines to suit her own vendetta. When the police eventually arrived, summoned by multiple frantic calls, they found Karen standing proudly with her arms crossed, the broken fence scattered like debris behind her. "I did what needed to be done," she declared to the officers, as though she were some kind of suburban vigilante. The AHOA board would spend weeks sorting through the fallout. Repair costs, insurance claims, emergency meetings, and heated arguments about Karen's membership status. But for the neighbors who had witnessed it, the image was unforgettable. A bulldozer tearing through a peaceful backyard, all because one woman couldn't tolerate the sight of a wooden fence. And that was the day the HOA realized they weren't just dealing with a difficult homeowner. They were dealing with someone who saw heavy machinery as a tool for enforcing her own version of a neighborhood order. The sound of wood splintering is not one most suburban neighborhoods are used to hearing on a Saturday morning. Lawnmowers, yes. Kids playing, sure. But the crack and snap of thick cedar posts being ripped from the ground, that was new. And that morning, thanks to Karen's bulldozer stunt, the HOA piece was shattered along with the fence. The fence itself wasn't just a few boards hammered together. It was sturdy, built years earlier with thick panels approved by the OA Architectural Committee. The homeowner had invested thousands into it, not only for privacy but also for safety. His dog loved to run the yard, and the fence kept him in. All that careful planning meant nothing when Karen decided her view rights were more important than property rights. As the bulldozer's blade slammed forward, the first panel groaned and tipped, the nails screeching as they were torn free from the posts. Then came the second, ripped loose like a tooth from the earth. Each crash echoed through the cul-de-sac, drawing more neighbors to their porches. Some gasped, others whispered, and a few muttered under their breath, "A lawsuit, definitely a lawsuit." The homeowner stood frozen for a moment before rushing toward the chaos, yelling, "Stop! That's my fence. You can't touch that. It's on my property." But Karen, standing triumphantly nearby, only smirked. "Your property? It's an eyesore that ruins the value of our neighborhood. I'm doing what the HOA should have done years ago." But the AAOI had never ruled against the fence. In fact, the board had repeatedly confirmed it was compliant. Karen simply didn't care. To her, the fence symbolized defiance, her neighbor's refusal to bend to her demands, and breaking it felt like a victory. Every snap of wood became a spectacle. Children peeked from behind their parents, wide-eyed at the destruction. Phones were out everywhere, filming the drama for proof, or maybe for future viral content. The HOA president tried to wave down the operator, shouting over the roar of the machine, but it was too late. By the time the bulldozer idled, a dozen panels lay scattered like pickup sticks across the yard. The homeowner's dog, confused and panicked, barked wildly, now able to dart out into the open street. That only fueled the anger of the crowd. "This isn't just a fence," one neighbor shouted. "You've put people's pets and kids at risk." Karen's response? A shrug. "I'll be so dramatic." "It's just wood. The neighborhood looks better already." But to everyone else, this wasn't just about wood and nails. It was about respect, about property lines, about the very purpose of HOA. If one member could bulldoze another's fence because she didn't like it, then what protection did anyone's property have? The broken fence pieces became physical evidence in what was sure to be a drawn-out legal battle. Photos were snapped, measurements taken, statements collected, Whens the HOA scrambled to issue emergency notices, distancing themselves from Karen's act. Yet the image that stuck most in everyone's mind was that moment of impact, the bulldozer's blade pushing forward, the wooden panels snapping like bones, the sound echoing through the neighborhood as if announcing, "The rules don't matter, only Karen's wool does." That moment when the fence broke, the community realized they weren't just witnessing property damage. They were watching their HOA's light show authority break under the weight of one person's ego. When the first crash of the fence echoed through the cul-de-sac, the homeowner, who had spent years maintaining that fence, ran outside in disbelief. For a split second, he thought maybe a tree had fallen, or maybe kids had hit the boards with a bike. But when he turned the corner and saw a bulldozer pushing his fence into the dirt, his jaw dropped. It felt surreal, like something out of a TV drama. Not his quiet suburban street. He stood frozen, watching the panels buckle one after another. The posts he had cemented into the ground with his own hands years ago snapped like twigs under the steel blade. His mind raced. This can't be real. She can't actually be doing this. The neighbors whispered, phones out, capturing every second. His face was red, not just from anger, but from the humiliation of having his private property destroyed in front of the entire HOA community. He shouted at the operator to stop, then turned to Karen. "What are you doing? This is my fence on my property." But Karen, standing with her arms crossed, responded as if she were the victim. "Your fence was illegal. It ruined my view. I'm fixing what the HOA wouldn't." The word stung. Not only had he gone through the official HOA approval process years ago, submitting drawings, materials, and property line surveys, but he had also paid extra to ensure everything met code. He had abided by every single rule, the very rules Karen now twisted to justify her crusade. The homeowner felt the weight of the community's eyes on him. Some neighbors looked at him with sympathy, shaking their heads at Karen's audacity. Others kept quiet, afraid of getting caught in the crossfire. But everyone could see his shock. He wasn't just angry, he was devastated. The fence wasn't just wood and nails. It was years of work, thousands of dollars, and a boundary that gave him privacy and security. Now, in a matter of minutes, it was rubble. Worse, Karen had done it so publicly, making him look powerless on his own property. He pulled out his phone and began recording, his voice trembling as he narrated the destruction. "This is my fence. Karen has hired a bulldozer to destroy it without permission. This is illegal. I'll be pressing charges." But behind the trembling voice was something else, a quiet determination. While Karen basked in the chaos, convinced she had won, the homeowner was already thinking ahead. Lawyers, insurance claims, HOA complaints, even civil court. The OA president arrived, breathless, trying to calm him down. But there was no calming down. The shocked neighbor wasn't just angry at Karen anymore. He was angry at the HOA, too. After all, Karen had been complaining about his fence for months, and the HOA had failed to rein her in. Now his property was destroyed, and everyone was scrambling to cover themselves. Standing over the pile of broken wood, he clenched his fists. The shock was turning into resolve. Karen thought she could bulldoze her way through the rules, but he was ready to fight her in the one place she couldn't scream and shout her way to victory, the courtroom. That morning, his face showed pure disbelief, but by evening, that shock had hardened into a promise. Karen had just picked a fight that would cost her far more than a view. The scene had already spiraled into chaos by the time the flashing red and blue lights rolled down the cul-de-sac. The bulldozer sat idling like a beast, its blade still littered with broken planks of wood. Karen stood proudly beside it, arms crossed, as if she had just performed some great service for the community. The homeowner stood opposite her, pacing in anger, his phone camera still recording every second. Around them, neighbors lined the sidewalks, whispering, filming, and pointing, witnesses to what had become the most outrageous HOA dispute in the neighborhood's history. When the first officer stepped out of the patrol car, the crowd seemed to exhale all at once. Finally, some authority was here to sort this madness out. The officer adjusted his belt, gave a sharp look at the bulldozer, and then at Karen. "Mom, can you explain why there's a piece of heavy machinery tearing down a fence on private property?" Karen didn't miss a beat. She raised her chin and said loudly, so everyone could hear, this fence was illegal. I'm a dues-paying member of this HOA, and I have every right to protect my property value. The board ignored my complaints, so I took action. The officer's expression was unreadable, but the neighbors nearly laughed out loud. They'd all sat through her rants at HOA meetings, and they all knew the fence had been approved long ago. Yet here Karen was, spinning her destruction as some kind of noble cause. The homeowner jumped in immediately. "Officer, this is my fence. I have the paperwork from the HOA. She brought a bulldozer onto my property without permission and destroyed thousands of dollars worth of materials. This is vandalism. This is trespassing." His voice cracked from a mix of fury and disbelief. The officer looked at him, then at the growing pile of shattered boards, then back at Karen. "Do you have proof the fence violated any laws or HOA regulations?" he asked. Karen, flustered, waved her hands. "It's common sense. Everyone knows it blocked the view. Ask anyone here." She turned to the neighbors expecting support, but the witnesses stayed silent. A few shook their heads. Others muttered, "Nope, that's her fight, not mine." One brave neighbor, phone still recording, stepped forward. "Officer, that fence was approved. We were at the meeting years ago when it passed. She's been harassing him about it for months. Today she went too far. That was all it took." Suddenly, more neighbors chimed in, voices overlapping. They told the officer about Karen's late-night rants, her shouting matches in the yard, her endless emails to the AOA. They described how she had called the fence an eyesore for years and threatened to handle it herself. The officer jotted down notes, his pen moving faster as the witnesses piled on. Karen's confident smirk began to fade. The homeowner, though still shaken, felt a flicker of hope. For once, Karen wasn't in control of the narrative. By the time a second patrol car arrived, the situation was clear. Karen had no legal ground to stand on. The fence had been approved, documented, and standing for years. The witnesses were unanimous. The police taped off the area, treating the broken boards as evidence. The HOA president, who had been nervously hovering nearby, stepped forward to tell the officers that the board had never authorized any removal of the fence. His words sealed the matter. Karen had acted entirely on her own. For the neighbors, it was a strange moment of unity. They may have had their own differences with the HOA, but that day they all stood as witnesses against Karen. For once, her voice was drowned out, not by another argument, but by the collective testimony of an entire street. The homeowner finally exhaled. He wasn't alone anymore. The police had listened, the witnesses had spoken, and the truth was on his side. Karen had wanted the neighborhood to rally around her cause. Instead, they rallied against her, proving that in an HOA community, witnesses could make or break the fight. When the bulldozer dust finally settled and the shouting died down, the question that hung in the air was the one that mattered most to the HOA. Where exactly was the property line? Karen had screamed for months that the fence was on her land. She had claimed loudly and often that the fence crept several feet into her backyard, stealing her view and lowering her home value. She quoted obscure HOA bylaws out of context, citing community easements and a shared visual rights, as though she were a lawyer instead of just a perpetually angry homeowner. But the homeowner knew better. Before he had ever built that fence, he had hired a surveyor, submitted the maps, and had the design reviewed by the AJ Architectural Committee. The paperwork was airtight. Still in the chaos of the bulldozer incident, the property line became the battleground for truth. The HOA board called for an emergency survey. A licensed surveyor arrived, rolling out long measuring tapes, marking flags, and pulling up property plats from the county records. Neighbors gathered on their lawns as though watching a sporting event. Everyone wanted to see who was right. Karen with her loud accusations, or her neighbor with his stack of documents. Karen hovered nearby, arms folded, muttering under her breath. "They'll see. That fence was never supposed to be there. I told them 100 times." Her confidence faltered when the surveyor began placing bright orange flags in the ground, each one carefully aligned with the original recorded property line. Slowly, the truth became visible, glowing like a neon boundary for everyone to see. The fence hadn't crossed into Karen's yard at all. In fact, the survey proved the opposite. If anything, the homeowner had built the fence slightly inside his property line, leaving a strip of land unused just to avoid conflict. The crowd murmured. Phones came out again, capturing the flags lined up neatly where the fence once stood. The visual evidence couldn't be denied. The homeowner let out a bitter laugh. You destroyed my fence for nothing. It wasn't even on your land. His voice carried through the cul-de-sac, raw with anger and vindication. Karen, red-faced, tried to recover. That can't be right. The maps are wrong. The HOA never enforces these things properly. I have a right to my view, but her protest fell flat. The surveyor calmly held up the official county plat and pointed to the markings. This is the legal line. There's no dispute. The HOA president, tired and embarrassed, stepped in. Karen, the survey is final. The fence was within his property. You had no authority to touch it, and certainly no right to demolish it. His tone carried the weight of not just the board, but of the entire community. Neighbors shook their heads, whispering about lawsuits, restitution, and how far Karen had gone this time. The homeowner, though still furious, finally had concrete proof that the fence was never the problem. It was Karen all along. The glowing line of survey flags became a symbol in the neighborhood. Where Karen saw an ugly barrier, the rest of the community now saw the clear boundary of justice. And for the first time, Karen realized that her shouting couldn't move a property line, no matter how loud it echoed at HOA meetings. That day, the HOA didn't just resolve a fence dispute. They redrew the battle lines, literally showing everyone that rules, documents, and boundaries would always outlast one neighbor's obsession with control.